Today's lecture begins by addressing what is, in the contemporary period, the most important development challenge, and that is the environmental crisis. The reason why it's the most important development challenge is that your generation is facing a historically unprecedented crisis which threatens the life support systems of the planet Earth. In other words, unless we address this problem of environmental degradation, and more specifically the crisis of climate change, all life on the planet will be threatened, not just human life. Okay? So we'll begin this lecture by indicating the nature of the crisis at hand, and then see what kind of policy measures have been specified to date to address that, and then see the performance of those policy measures that were taken, in a sense, at a global level during the Paris summit. And the reason why we're going to look at that progress is to simply suggest that those policy measures haven't worked. And the crisis, instead of being mitigated, reduced, is getting worse. So we've got to find some way of addressing this crisis, or we at least need to think about how to find a way of addressing this crisis effectively. And the pursuit of that question of how do we address this is essentially a matter of survival for your generation and, in fact, all life on Earth. Okay, so let's start by identifying the crisis itself. See, the problem of the environmental crisis and the dangers of climate change were first pointed out by the famous Brundtland Commission, which was set up in the mid-1980s. This was the World Commission on Environment and Development, which was chaired by Mrs. Brundtland. And they, based on the best science available, they got some brilliant scientists together and a few young social scientists. And I had the honor and privilege of working with Mrs. Brundtland. They got a few, so basically it was a natural science exercise, and we youngsters were just brought in as social scientists to give a more sort of interdisciplinary base to the policy proposals that were being made. But essentially, the scientists got together, and in that report, they established one thing, and that was that the physical environment of the Earth, on the basis of which life is sustained, that physical environment is being degraded to a dangerous extent. They weren't able to say that it's critical, the damage, whether it's reversible or not at that stage, but certainly the whistle was blown that the Earth's life support system, the physical environment, on the basis of which fresh water is produced for us to irrigate soils and drink, fresh air, breathable air is produced, and fertile soils are maintained to be able to produce food. So air, water, and soils have to be maintained at a certain level of efficacy for these services of water, irrigation, drinking, food, and the ability to breathe these are called eco-services. These eco-services could be maintained. And they brought home the fact that these services are being maintained or have been maintained through the history of the planet, or at least through the history of human life. These services have been maintained because of an ecosystem which is in a state of delicate balance. What appears to us as fragmented elements like forests and earth and rain and oceans and rivers are actually integrated, including human beings, are integrated into an ecosystem in a delicate balance through which life is maintained, all life, human life and other species, and through which, and that life is being maintained because of the fertility of the soil, the freshness of the air, and the clean water. And it was this they felt that was under threat. And they pointed out, although in a provisional way, that this degradation of the environment was being caused because of the way human beings are intervening into the ecosystem. That report remained, it woke people up. But as I pointed out at the time to Mrs. Brundtland when the first draft was produced, this report had three very important assumptions, or three very important implications, shall we say, which undermined the way social sciences were being practiced at the time, particularly economics and economic policy. And it required rethinking economics and much of social science. So here you'll ask the question, what were those important propositions that the report was propounding, which in a sense was threatening the social science, the whole edifice of social science, particularly economics? For that, we'll have to understand how they defined sustainable development. Now, sustainable development, according to the Brundtland Commission report, and that definition continues to remain and is used, sustainable development is that development which enables the present generation to fulfill its needs without undermining the capacity of future generations to fulfill their needs. In other words, the process of reproducing our lives currently involves using the physical environment. But we are required to use that physical environment in such a way that we don't damage it to such an extent that the next generation doesn't stand the same chance of reproducing their lives that we have had. That means that this particular way of looking at development in terms of sustainable development, that was a new way of doing it, of doing development, sustainable development. This particular way of looking at development implied three propositions. The first is that we owe a sense of responsibility towards future generations, generations that are not yet born. We owe a responsibility to it, because it's only concern for them and their welfare that will induce us to use the physical environment in such a way that we don't permanently damage it, because the future generations are going to inherit the same physical environment. So the first proposition that emerges is, which was completely new to economics, was that we owe a sense of responsibility to future generations. Here is the idea of responsibility. You see, because in neoclassical, the mainstream economics of the time, and still is so, mainstream economics holds the view that each individual pursues his or her material welfare in isolation from other individuals. The individual owes no responsibility towards other individuals. He or she only owes responsibility to herself or himself. And that responsibility is to maximize material welfare within their own lifetimes. Okay, so that's the first thing about responsibility, social responsibility towards future generations. And my argument at the time was that, well, if that is what you are, how you're defining sustainable development, then overcoming poverty and reducing inequality has to be built into the idea of sustainable development. Why? Because if the definition of sustainable development is suggesting that we owe responsibility towards generations yet unborn, then surely we owe a sense of responsibility to the present generation that's deprived of the minimum conditions of civilized human existence. We owe a sense of responsibility towards the poor, towards those who are deprived. So addressing inequality, reducing inequality and overcoming poverty is an integral part of the idea of has to be an integral part of the idea of sustainable development. So now that's the second very important proposition that follows out of the idea that there is a sense of responsibility involved here, social responsibility. The associated issue, implicit sort of proposition, is that since the global ecosystem is integrated, there's no question of national boundaries that come into ecosystem. The ecosystem, in a sense, is independent of national boundaries. Since the ecosystem is integrated at a global level, it means that people are interdependent for the continuation of their individual or national lives. Countries are dependent on other countries, and human beings are dependent on other human beings. There is interdependence between countries across the world, and there's interdependence between people even within the same country. The way this comes out powerfully in terms of the environment is that if you pollute the environment in one part of the world because you're throwing out too much toxic waste into the soils or too much methane and other greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide into the air, you're going to, as a result of throwing out these greenhouse gases, going to change the climate of the world, not just your own climate. So in that sense, what you do in one part of the world is going to affect the way people live in other parts of the world. So there's an idea of interdependence here. First is responsibility, second is interdependence. There's a third element involved in the idea of sustainable development. And that is that if we owe a sense of responsibility towards others in the future and today across space and across time, then we have to design public policy in such a way that these views can be translated into policy practice. Which, in other words, if you're operating in a particular nation, the world unfortunately is divided into nation states, whereas the ecology, the ecosystem is integrated across space. But if in any particular country you decide to pursue your purely national material interests through public policy, you design public policies through which, for example, you produce energy in the cheapest possible way available, and if that cheapest possible way is using dirty coal technology, well, you use it because you want to produce energy at the cheapest possible cost. The argument here in terms of sustainable development is that if you do that, you damage the interests of other countries because you are, as a result of using dirty coal-based technologies going to increase the carbon dioxide in the air and methane and create a danger that there will be global warming, which will damage the interests of a lot of other countries. So in other words, national policies have to be aligned with international policy and take account of the interests of the world, not just the interests of your particular nation state. That's the implication in terms of public policy. Okay, that's why Mrs. Brundtland placed, if you read that book, it's on your reading list. I wonder how many people have come across it. The Brundtland Commission report argues that you've got to build new, what she calls new institutions, new sets of rules in individual countries and in terms of international agreements, which put into effect such public policies which are global in character. That all countries of the world have to follow those policies in order for the ecosystem to be preserved, which is in a sense essentially global in nature. That was Mrs. Brundtland's very strong argument. Achha. Now, over time, this report was produced in 1986. It saw the public, it saw the light of day in 1986. By 2003, I think it was, another major scientific undertaking occurred in the form of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climatic Change, fifth assessment report. Now that fifth assessment report, which is also in your reading list, won the Nobel Prize, because it was considered to be, it's well worth reading the summary of that report, which is in your reading list. It was thought to be the greatest scientific undertaking in human history, because it had brought together hundreds of the world's leading scientists in different fields related with the environment, physicists, chemists, biologists, earth scientists, brought hundreds of these leading economists in the world and made data available that was being collected in 70,000 different locations across the planet over a 10-year period. So they had vast amount of data, and these scientists then used cutting-edge mathematical techniques to analyze that data and produce this report called the Fifth Assessment Report. Now, underlying the complexity and the technical rigor of that report are two fairly simple propositions, or two fundamental propositions which the report makes, which are in a sense imply complex policy decisions, but in a sense are also simple to understand. They are, firstly, that global warming is occurring. They were able to bring together overwhelming evidence to show that global warming was occurring in terms of the patterns of temperature increases over time. And it was made very clear on the basis of evidence that this global warming is not occurring as a result of some natural long-term climatic cycle. That was the second proposition, was that this global warming is occurring as a result of human intervention into the planet's ecosystem. And by human intervention, they meant, in a sense, our forms of life and production and the kinds of technologies that we were using. So the two propositions were, one, that global warming is a fact, it's not a fiction, and two, that this global warming is occurring as a result of the way we live and the lifestyles we have chosen to live in, and the way the technologies, the trajectory of technological change that has occurred since the Industrial Revolution which is essentially based on fossil fuels. And as a result, what's happened is over time that carbon dioxide and sulfur and methane, these so-called greenhouse gases, have built up to such a level that they're increasing the average temperatures of the planet. Now, you might say, so what? Temperatures have increased, so what's the problem? It's become slightly hotter than before. Winters in many countries have become more pleasant. It's less cold, especially in the northern areas. So what's the problem here? Well, they said the consequence of global warming is threefold, which is likely to have an adverse effect on human life and indeed all life. The first is that the intensity and frequency of extreme climatic events will increase. You will have more devastating storms and more frequent of these intensive storms. You will have more devastating floods and more frequent floods. You will have more devastating droughts and more frequent droughts. So the intensity and frequency of extreme climatic events will increase according to the report, which is the consequence of global warming. The second was that as a result of this, sea levels will rise because the polar ice caps will begin to melt. And that will raise sea levels. The rising sea levels will affect low elevation coastal zones across the world. Across, in every continent, those parts of the coastline which are low elevation, they'll be flooded by ocean water. Maybe the ocean water will go back a little, but it will salinize those soils, and so agriculture can't be practiced in those areas. As a result, there could be mass migration inland from the coastal zones. In the case of South Asia, the IPCC specifically estimated that something like 125 million people who are currently getting their livelihood from these low elevation coastal zones will be moving inland. Now imagine 125 million people moving inland across districts and district boundaries and provincial boundaries and even state boundaries. The disruption that could cause at a social and political level. The third consequence of global warming, it was argued, was that it will reduce the yields per acre of food grain crops, because the current seeds which are being used for agriculture production are highly sensitive to heat. So they argued that if there's for example, a 2.5 degrees centigrade increase in average temperatures, in the case of South Asia, there would be 30% reduction in the yield per acre, 30% reduction, absolute reduction in yield per acre, not a reduction in the growth rate, but a 30% reduction in the yield per acre at the absolute level of food grain crops. Now, for that, if that were, God forbid, to happen, we're talking about major famines. In a region where the population is growing, and at the global level the population is growing also, although not as rapidly as in South Asia perhaps. And if food output is actually reduced, that would cause a major food scarcity situation, famines. So therefore, the global warming that was associated with the buildup of carbon dioxide in the air was obviously going to have, at the global level, serious adverse effects for human society and for human beings. Of course, these effects would vary depending on which part of the globe you lived in. They would be relatively much greater in the case of South Asia for reasons that we'll discuss in the course later. Because South Asia, 60% of the population is dependent either directly or indirectly on agriculture. And agriculture is directly dependent on the timeliness of monsoons. And what global warming would do is that it would increase the variability of the monsoons with respect to timing and the quantum of rainfall, and indeed the location of the rainfall. So the effects would be particularly adverse for a country that's dependent on agriculture and on monsoons. But generally speaking, it would have an adverse effect, as we just discussed. Now, for a while, countries didn't wake up to the seriousness of the situation that the IPCC was pointing out. But then, a world summit, there was a series of summits, but the key summit that occurred was the Paris Climate Summit. And in that, the world's leaders were subjected to the authority of scientists. And they informed the assembled statesmen of the world that, look, they came up with a very interesting scientific prediction. See, the thing about the defining feature of science, as Karl Popper has defined science, is that it has both an explanatory power as well as a predictive power. And the scientists gave an explanation of what was happening in terms of global warming, but they also predicted that if average global temperatures increased by more than 2%, 2 degrees centigrade, if the average global temperatures increased by more than 2 degrees centigrade, then the entire climate system, the ecosystem of the world could be destabilized. They basically argued that beyond 2 degrees centigrade average rise in temperatures by the end of the century, we were in uncharted domain. There were no models set up to tell us what would happen to the world if that happened, if temperatures rose beyond 2 degrees centigrade. And you could have a catastrophe of unimaginable proportions at the global level. So serious, so powerful was the data presented and the arguments given that it convinced the statesmen, and they got concerned. And so they made certain very important decisions collectively for the first time, which were to be operative at a global level. I mean, there were other summits of a similar kind. There was the Tokyo summit, and then the Copenhagen summit. There was the Kyoto summit, then the Copenhagen summit, and so on. But this summit had a sense of urgency about it. And they agreed amongst themselves that every country must start reducing its emissions, carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions. It must start reducing, so that at a global level, by the year 250, there would be zero net emissions of carbon dioxide and the other greenhouse gases. Zero net emissions target was specified. Similarly, the target of poverty reduction was specified and said, by a certain date, all poverty in the world must be removed through public policy. Both these objectives of eliminating poverty and reducing inequality on the one hand, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions to zero by the year 2050, were agreed by the countries assembled. Now, agreement meant that each of these countries had to present a plan on how they would achieve their national targets. The global target was to be translated into national targets. So how will they achieve their national targets? And so they had to lay out a plan. What kind of incentive, disincentive system would they introduce so as to shift people from dirty technologies to clean technologies? What kind of policies will they undertake and resources committed to develop a new trajectory of technological change where they shifted from fossil fuel based technologies to, let's say, solar technology or wind technology, etc. Alternative clean energy production technologies. They had to do that, right? And more or less every country did. We did a bit of a fudge exercise in the Pakistani case, but most countries came up with provisional programs. In any case, at the end of the day, what they had all agreed on was that by the end of the century, we must make sure that global temperatures don't rise by more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. The science told them that it has to be, if you go beyond 2 degrees centigrade, you could have a cataclysmic set of consequences. So to remain on the safe side, they said, okay, we'll fix 1.5 degrees centigrade target for the world in terms of temperature increase by the end of the century. But to reach that target of 1.5 degrees centigrade increase by the end of the century, they had to achieve zero emissions by the year 2050. Okay? That's another 31 years from now. Zero emissions. Which meant that every country had to start reducing its greenhouse gas emissions on an annual basis. So now we finished the first part of the story. The nature of the crisis and policy decision that were taken to address it. Now we come to the second part. What was the actual performance? Here we have all countries agreed in Paris. I'm going to show you, don't worry, not more than 2 graphs. What you see on the left hand side, by the way, the axes are identical. You have years on the x-axis and greenhouse gas carbon dioxide emissions on the vertical axis in terms of metric tons of CO2, right? Metric tons of CO2. Now, from 1960 to 2017, in fact 2019, you see a steady and rather sharp increase in these greenhouse gas emissions. They haven't declined. In fact, between 2017 and 2019, these last 2 years, greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide emissions have increased at the rate of 2% a year, whereas they should have declined. So that has continued to increase at a rather worrying rate, even since 1960. On the right hand side is the decline in carbon dioxide emissions that has to occur starting now in order to hit zero emissions by the year 2050. So here you find that something like 3.04% annual reduction in emissions has to take place if we are to hit the specified target by 2050 of zero emissions. Now the reason why I put both these figures of what should happen between now and 2050 and what has actually happened between 2060 and 1960 and now, the reason why I put both these graphs together with identical axes is to bring home to you the fact that we are doing the reverse of what is required to save the planet. when emissions should be declining, they're actually increasing. Which means that the public policy required to meet the target of zero emissions by the year 2050 and of restricting the increase in global temperatures to less than 1.5 degrees centigrade by the year 2100 is not likely to be met if we continue to do business in the way we're doing. For this trend to shift from a rising one to a declining one, clearly some radical change in public policy has to occur at the national as well as global levels. Agreed? Okay, now we're going to go to the third part of the discussion and try to understand what would be the basis of this completely new policy paradigm, if you like. And remember, this change in policy has to occur in a world which is divided into nation states. And the point is that the people living in those states, the nations, by and large, in almost every country of the world, every state of the world, those nations want an improvement in the material welfare of the people. They want to have a larger volume and range of goods and services being produced in the cheapest possible way. How do you deal with that kind of world and yet reduce emissions in this drastic fashion that the two graphs point out? Clearly, there has to be a change, a deep change in human consciousness in terms of three dimensions of our existence. First, the way we relate with each other as human beings has to change. We have to re-experience what it is to be human in order to be able to create public policy that is driven by a sense of responsibility, as Mr. Brunton said. And that has to recognize the interdependence between people and between countries. So there has to be a change in the relationship between human beings, apart as a bedrock of the change in the relations between states. The second is that there has to be a change in our relationship with commodities. By and large, in the particularly in the post-industrial revolution period, a historically unique relationship has emerged, which wasn't there before, between humans and commodities. And that is that commodities are considered to be not just functional entities. A car is seen not simply in terms of a way of getting from A to B, as a vehicle that takes you from A to B, or an aftershave lotion is not simply something that gives you fragrance and makes you smell nice, but that these commodities have become the emblem of status and power. Qualities which human beings themselves possess of efficacy, of power, of sexuality, are being transposed into commodities. And we are asked to look at commodities not in terms simply of their functional attributes, but as receptacles of these qualities which we once possessed. So it's not the male who's, it's not the human being who's sexually attractive, the male or the female, but becomes attractive as a result of consuming the aftershave lotion or the perfume. Right? It's not the human being who has efficacy and dynamism and power. It's the motor car which contains these objects. So in a sense, we try to possess objects not in terms of simply the fact that they're objects of convenience, they have certain functional qualities. We look upon objects in a kind of totemic fashion, where we try to possess objects essentially to repossess ourselves as human beings, to repossess those qualities which we now imagine have been transposed into commodities. So in other words, a profound change in the relationship between humans and commodities has to take place in order for us to become responsible towards other human beings who don't have these commodities, or towards other creatures that would be threatened, their very existence would be threatened by our forms of social life and economic lives, our ways of extracting resources from the planet, our ways of fabricating those resources into objects, and our ways of using those objects, and our ways of disposing of the waste. All these, each of these activities in the production and consumption and disposal chain could affect not just other human beings, but all life. So we've got to not only change the way we relate with each other as human beings, but the way we relate with commodities. And the third is that we've got to change the way we relate with nature. Over the last 300 years, we have seen nature as a set of fragmented resources that are to be used as inputs into the process of production or consumption. So what exists, even in terms of science, at a physical level, what exists as an integrated ecosystem in our consciousness is fragmented and broken up into separate entities, which we call resources, that can be used, that can be exploited for producing more goods and services. So the rivers are a resource, forests are a resource. You can cut forests and build various objects. In the British times, the forest department in India was set up to cut forests, to provide wood to produce the butts of rifles in the First World War. Right? So forests are seen as a resource too, that are to be cut to be used for objects, as is water. And so are the oceans, a resource. So to create a fundamentally new basis of public policy that would take account of the interdependence of human beings and express our social responsibility and our human solidarity towards other human beings and towards the future generations, a profound change in what I call consciousness has to take place in the way we relate with each other, the way we relate with the commodities, and the way we relate with nature. Okay, now one indication of the urgency of this task, which we'll go into a little bit later, is simply the contradiction, as was pointed out by the curves, I was given it figures. The emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, have been growing at 5.3% annually from 1960 to 2017. Whereas what needs to be done in the next 50 years, next 3 decades, by the year 2050, if you were to reach the target, they have to decline by 3.03% annually. Such a radical change in public policy can only be embedded, can only be derived from a new kind of consciousness. The sense of greed has to be replaced by a sense of compassion, of care, not just to other human beings, but to all nature. Okay. So this brings us to the question of compassion. Just another example of the urgency of the situation is the species extinction rate. In the pre-industrial revolution period, preceding ages of man, the extinction rate was about 2 species per year were going extinct. This is called the background extinction rate or the natural extinction rate. Now, the rate at which species are dying, extinction rate has increased to by 1,000 times, 1,000%. We are now losing 2,000 species per year, whereas the pre-industrial was 2 species a year. Clearly, we brought about a drastic change in the physical environment in which species survive. And if these species are dying at such a rapid rate, clearly human beings are also under threat as a species. And my argument is that in order to be able to do a radical change in the public policy and save not just human life on this planet, but all life, we have to inculcate a new kind of consciousness, which at the root of it has to be compassion, loving care towards others and towards nature. Now, if you look at the perennial tradition, the message of all the religions and all the wisdom traditions is common. They all emphasize the importance of, in fact, the defining feature of being human is that we are compassionate. We have to inculcate compassion. All religions and wisdom traditions talk about the journey to the heart. If you want to experience God or contact God, journey to the heart. And that journey requires you to nurture your capacity to love, your compassion. Now, it's very interesting that the root of the word education is educare, educare. Education, the root is educare. You know what educare means? Bringing to the surface that which is dormant in us. And what is it that is dormant in us, has been for the last 300 years, is precisely compassion. So in other words, this consciousness, what we can call a humane consciousness, involves a new kind of education, or the old kind of education, if you like. A new kind of education which nurtures compassion in addition to giving you high quality skills in each of the social sciences and natural sciences. Obviously, you've got to master the existing knowledge in these fields and take it forward, which is essential for you to be able to exercise compassion. But then you have to also have compassion, which must become the basis of public policy in the future. It's very interesting that while all religions emphasize this, compassion is seen as virtue, self-evident virtue is compassion. All religions do that. I'll talk about the heart in a little while also, but compassion. But Islam particularly proposes that inculcation of compassion. In the Quran, for example, an attribute that in terms of which God describes himself most frequently is the attribute of Rahman ar-Rahim. And what is the root of the word Rahm? Rahm is not, I mean, it's in simple English is translated as compassionate and merciful. Rahm is, this mercy is not derived from pity, but from love. Because the root of the word Rahm in Arabic is Rahma. And you know what Rahma means? The mother's womb. So, loving care is an attribute of God who in his infinite mercy has granted to human beings as his vice-regents on earth. As the Quran says, God's rule is a rule of mercy, of compassion. But human beings, if they are to exercise this function as vice-regents, must also exercise compassion in the way they function in the world and look after each other and also look after other creatures. Each of the formal religions are merely paths to this center, to God, this loving care. Which is why Bulle Shah, one of the great Sufis of the Punjab, said, "Dha de mandir, dha de masjid." These are formal aspects of that path, which are specific to individual religions. Dha de mandir, dha de masjid, dha de jo koi dhanda, ik bandiyan da dil na dhavi, Rab dilan vich rehanda. Demolish the mandir, demolish the mosque, demolish all that can be demolished, but do not injure the heart of man, for that is the abode of God. Now I'll end by trying to explicate what is meant by the word heart. And you know, it's very interesting that this meaning of the word heart that I'm just going to explain is common to both the Western as well as the Eastern traditions. All traditions, religious and wisdom traditions, are talking about the journey to the heart, and they mean the same thing by the word heart. So what is it that they mean by the word heart? Heart is not the organ by that name. I mean, it's the center of the human body. It pumps out blood and lungs purify it, bring it back and keeps, so it's the center of the body. But the way the term heart is used in these religious and wisdom traditions is that it is the center of human consciousness. It is the deepest part of our consciousness. It is the site where human beings come into contact with God. Which is why in both the Western and Eastern traditions, the term heart by the term heart they mean the instrument of experiencing the transcendent. That faculty of the human being through which you are able to experience what is non-material, through which you are able to experience the ultimate truth, the ultimate reality. It is that human faculty, the heart. Which is why in the medieval period, up to the medieval period, the term heart and the term intellect was used synonymously. The word intellect is derived from the Latin intellectus, which also means the instrument of experiencing the transcendent. So the heart and the intellect are the same. Now, in what now? Of course, the distorted meaning of the term intellect, as it has appeared in the post-Enlightenment period, is that it's sort of some kind of mental activity that takes place in the intellect. It's not just that. It addresses and enlists, brings into play two fundamental dimensions of being human, the intellect. The first is the ability to analyze, our ability for reason, logic. And the second is our ability to synthesize. Second is our ability to experience, shall we say, the aesthetic ability, the ability to experience beauty, a sense of transcendent harmony, the ability to come into contact. Simply the ability to pray requires establishing contact with God. So that's part of the intellect too. Reason and the intellect. Reason and the spiritual dimension or the aesthetic dimension are both elements in the intellect, as far as the traditional view was concerned. Now, of course, it's been narrowed down and twisted and distorted into just the mind. We've got to return to that old one. Now, it's very interesting that if Karen Armstrong has talked about nurturing compassion, and the idea that we have to bring to the surface of what is dormant in us, which is our capacity for love, loving care. But that is something that all religions and all wisdom traditions are arguing for. The only point now is that that kind of education that combines reason with this transcendent capability called compassion are necessary to be able to survive. We've got to innovate to find new kinds of technologies that would prevent the environment from being destroyed. But we've also got to rediscover ourselves as human beings who can love and care and design forms of public action in which compassion would become operational, would become real. Our relationship with nature has to change, as I said. First of all, our relationship with others has to change, as I just pointed out. But our relationship with commodities also has to change. It's very interesting that for the ancient Greeks, like Aristotle, commodities, goods were simply useful. They were objects of convenience. Unlike now, when we see them, as I said, as receptacles of some supernatural abilities. In his Nicomachean Ethics, he points out, Aristotle, he's talking about value. What is it that's value? He says that goods cannot be of value because they're merely useful. What is of value is human functioning. And then he goes on to ask, what is human functioning? And he says, human functioning according to the principles of virtue. That is human functioning. And then he goes on to say that functioning according to the principles of virtue accords with the logic of the soul. So, in other words, there is a structure of the soul that God has designed, and that structure of the soul gives us the propensity for virtue. for loving care. A student of Socrates who lived before Aristotle asked him, "Oh, Socrates, you keep talking about virtue, why should live a life of virtue? Why should we live a life of virtue? When I can, by deceiving other people, by being harsh to other people, I can become very wealthy." You know what his answer was? Socrates said, "Glucon. If you live a life of virtue, you give pleasure to the soul." So Socrates is talking about, he didn't say goods can't give you any pleasure. He said it gives pleasure to the soul. So in other words, there are levels of pleasure. There's a pleasure you get from driving a nice car. But there's also the pleasure of helping somebody who's suffering. I'll give you an example very recently of neuroscience. These neuroscientists, did an experiment with monkeys. Now, this ability for compassion or being concerned about other members of the same species predates human beings, which is why, Darwin, etc., argue that it gives you an evolutionary advantage, this ability for compassion, for caring for other people. And these scientists performed this experiment on primates, monkeys. And there is this one monkey which is being given electric shocks. So he's very uncomfortable. And in front of him, they train that monkey to pull a lever. Because once he pulls the lever, the shocks stop. So the monkey is very happy when he pulls the lever. He learns how to pull the lever. But then he notices there's another monkey next to him who is also suffering from shocks. So what this first monkey does, that he pulls the lever for the other monkey to prevent that suffering by him. He pulls the other monkey's thing. The scientists made it a really tough experiment, because what they did was they gave this first monkey the choice between eating food and pulling the lever of the second monkey to relieve him from electric shocks. And the first monkey gave up his food to be able to pull the lever that stopped giving suffering to the other monkey. So this sense of empathy is built into the very structure of our soul, as Aristotle pointed out, of virtue. And primates have it also before us. Maybe it gives this cooperation based on caring for each other may give us an evolutionary advantage when we do things together, as in the past. We were able to hunt together better as teams. But today, more than at any other time in history, this cooperation, this sense of caring for others is a matter of survival. Because you've got to change your pattern of emissions from a rising trend to a declining trend, as we pointed out on this graph. And that requires a new relationship with each other, a new relationship with goods. They have to be seen in the proper perspective, as Aristotle said, they're merely useful, but also a new relationship with nature. You see, historically, in the older religions, nature had a dual function. On the one hand, nature enabled you to survive physically. You got water, you got fertile soils, you were able to breathe the air. So it enabled you to walk on terra firma. But God also catered for the fact that while you're walking on the ground, your head was aiming for the heavens. And so nature is also a means, one of the means through which we can nurture our aesthetic ability, our sense of beauty. And as Keats said, beauty is truth, and truth beauty. It is through nature, meditating upon nature, its ineffable harmony, its beauty, that we can get opening of the door to God. That is why in the Quran, nature is referred to as signs of the presence of God. Sign or signature means affirmation. So nature affirms, it signifies God. And so there is this dual function. Nature enables us to physically live, but it also gives us that fantastic education of nurturing and helping us on the path to the heart, to God. Now, if you think about this, nature enables us to live simultaneously in the ephemeral. After all, we have very limited lifespans, and we are able to grow food and eat food, drink water and breathe air, and live transient lives. But we're also able to experience a transcendent in those that infinite, that timeless experience of God. So in other words, nature enables us to simultaneously live in the ephemeral and the eternal. And it is that relationship which we have to relearn, that we've forgotten over the centuries, and which came naturally, to the great saints, the Sufis, the Red Indians, the great Maharishis. We've got to relearn that. So we've got to have both scientific ability and the ability to solve problems through innovation, but we also must nurture our capacity to love, which is the ability to save all life on this planet. Thank you very much.